there's a big difference between the way the pros track guitars and the way everyone else tracks guitars. And in this video, I'm going to talk about 7 mistakes that frankly almost everyone is making when recording guitars. The first one is not checking the guitar setup first. Now, when I say guitar setup, what I'm talking about is mostly intonation and action. So for those of you who maybe aren't experienced guitar players, maybe you are and you just really haven't thought about this stuff yet, intonation is basically how well the guitar is in tune all the way up and down the fretboard. So basically, a lot of times you can tune the open string and it might be in tune, but as you're fretting different notes, especially the higher up you go, it's going to either go sharp or flat, and this causes a big problem when you're recording guitars. Another thing that can affect the intonation on a guitar is the action, which is basically the height of the string above the fretboard. And so the higher the action is, the farther you have to actually press down that string to get it onto the fret, and that's going to pull it sharp as well. So before you start tracking guitars, you want to check the intonation. And you do that by simply tuning the open string and then checking in the 12th fret to see if it's still in tune. Now, if it's flat at the 12th fret, that means that you need to decrease the distance between the bridge and this fret by moving the bridge saddle forward. Or if it's sharp at the 12th fret, you need to do the opposite. You need to move this bridge saddle back. But be careful not to only worry about what the tuning is at the 12th fret and way up high here, because you usually don't play up there that often. You also want to just double check that your tuning is pretty good and your intonation is decent down at these lower frets as well, because if your intonation looks spot on way up here, but it's off on the 5th and 7th fret, then you really haven't gained anything. And I see this problem a lot, especially on basses more than guitars, but it definitely happens on guitars too. And for me, this issue of intonation and just how well the guitar is in tune across the fretboard is so important to me that I would rather record a guitar with slightly worse tone, but better tuning and intonation, rather than having a guitar that maybe sounds better tone-wise, but has horrible tuning and intonation. All right, the second mistake that most people are making is using the wrong string gauge. And when I say the wrong string gauge, usually I'm talking about strings that are way too light. Most guitar players like to play on really light strings. I don't know why. I guess it's easy to bend and stuff, and they want to do cool lead lines and solos or something, or maybe it just doesn't hurt their fingers as much and they're lazy. I really don't know, but almost everyone brings in strings that are way too light into the studio. So why is this a problem? Well, it comes down again to the tuning. So if you have really light strings, the problem is most guitar players have some flaws or a lot of flaws in their playing technique, and it works with both hands, both on their strumming hand and on the fret hand here. So with really light strings, what's going to happen as players are fretting chords, especially if they're stretching across the neck like this, they're going to slightly bend the strings down a little bit. That's going to pull the note sharp, so the tuning's going to be off. And just in general, riffing across the neck, changing chords and stuff, people, if you watch the fretboard as people are playing guitar, the strings are often bent and contorted in all sorts of weird and bad ways. And then on the strumming hand as well, as you pick the string, like look what's happening. You're going to pick a string, it's going to bend down a bit, right? Now, the more it bends down, the pitch is going to go sharp, and that's what gives you the phenomenon of the string going like boom and the pitch dropping over time. So the lighter your string is, the more both of those problems are going to happen. But using heavier strings is going to help on both sides of this problem. So on your fret hand, the thicker your strings are, the harder it's going to be for someone's fingers to really pull those strings sharp. And even if they are moving a little bit, you're going to notice a lot less variance in the pitch. And then also on your strumming hand, with picking the string, with heavier strings, the harder you play, they're not going to move as much, they're not going to bend as much, and you'll have a more consistent pitch rather than the boom phenomenon I just talked about. Plus, you get better tone because the player can play a lot harder without causing all these tuning issues, which means you can really dig in, and that's where you get a nice aggressive tone. When you have to kind of push harder into the amp with maybe a lower gain setting, you're going to get a more aggressive and energetic guitar tone than someone who's playing really light strings and has to kind of strum really lightly to make sure they don't mess up the tuning. As a starting point for string gauges, for standard tuning, I would recommend an 11 to 52, so a 52 on that low string. Now, if you're dropping the tuning below that, let's say to drop C, which is my least favorite tuning, but I won't get into that now, I would want a 60 gauge on that low string. And if you're going down below that, well, hopefully you're using a 7-string or a baritone guitar, you'll get way better results with that. But if you're using a 6-string guitar, you probably want like a 68 or a 72 gauge string on the low end here. And even with that, it's going to be a tuning nightmare. All right, mistake number 3 is dialing in the tone blindly. And I'll explain this with my own experience. Like when I was in bands before I got into the engineering side of things, I would go into the studio to record with my band, and we'd be so excited to try and get a great guitar tone, right? We'd always like rent these really cool, expensive amps, or we'd borrow like the best amps that our friends had, and we'd try them all out, and we'd try to get this amazing tone. But every time we recorded, we get the final result, and I always hated the guitar tone. Like it never sounded anything like what I was used to standing in front of the amp. I never liked it. And the reason why is quite simple, because I had never been in that studio before. I had only played guitar in front of my amp, in front of my cab. That was my only reference. So I didn't know what my guitar tone was supposed to sound like, through a mic and then through these studio monitors in a room that I've never been in before and didn't know at all. And I think that's why a lot of people struggle to get a good guitar tone during tracking something that they feel confident is going to work in the final mix, because they're flying blind. But the solution to this is really, really simple, and it's to reference guitar tones while you're trying to dial in the sound. It's the same way that you use reference tracks while you're mixing, right? You want to compare to other finished records that you like to make sure you're not way off base or way too bright or way too dark or muddy or whatever it is. Do the exact same thing in the studio while you're dialing in your guitar tones. So for me, I'll pull up the plugin or the amp setup and we'll try and dial in a tone, and then I'll go to my mix reference playlist and I'll play some of those songs. And then I'll go back and play some of the guitar and reference back and forth between different songs of kind of the ballpark of tone that we're going for. And I want that guitar tone to sound like 90% like those finished records right there during tracking. It's one of those things that when I give this tip, people are like, oh, duh, like that makes so much sense. Why am I not doing that? You're waiting all the way to the end of the mix process to use a reference track. You should be doing that along the way as you're dialing in tones and choosing your sounds at the source. And that way, you can get all the way to the final mix and your guitar tone needs like almost no EQing, no processing. Trust me, it's very, very possible if you just reference at the beginning. Mistake number 4 is overcomplicating the setup. So using multiple mics on the cab, trying to blend together multiple amps or multiple cabs at the same time, using a whole bunch of pedals on the way in. And you don't need to do this. If you go and listen to my portfolio on Spotify, for all of the records that I actually tracked and mixed myself, 95% of them is just a single SM57 on the amp. And on all of those records I promise you it's either a JCM 800 or a 5150, both through the same Mesa 2x12 cab with vintage 30s, 157 in the right spot. That's it. Now, I'm not against using, let's say, multiple mics on a cab. Sometimes a 57 with a ribbon mic can really give you a nice thick tone. But again, that's probably only on 5% of the records I've done. And I really think that if you can't get a great guitar tone with just a tried and true amp with a single SM57 in the right spot, you shouldn't move on and get more complicated than that until you figure that one out. Keep it simple. Just go for the minimal amount of pedals, one amp, one cab, one mic. It's going to be far better for you in the end. Mistake number 5 is not tuning enough while you're recording. Okay, it is definitely not enough to just tune up the guitar before the session and then get through an entire song or even half a song or heck, even one section without tuning again. You need to be tuning all the time. And unless you have an Evertune guitar, which I really love and would recommend, but most people don't have them. So you need to be tuning a lot. And I mean a lot, like after almost every single take, at least check it, because tuning is going to be a huge challenge in the studio no matter what. There's so many things that affect it. The player, the technique, the temperature. In my old studio, we had this mini split AC unit. And every time the AC kicked on, I would just stop recording and be like, we need to tune again. The guitar's going to go sharp. And without fail, within like 5 or 10 seconds of the AC going on, the guitar would be like 5 or 10 cents sharp. And this happens even in really big pro studios. Just the climate, the humidity, the temperature is going to affect the tuning of the guitar. It really can be a nightmare. So check your tuning all the time. Use a good tuner. Use a tuner that displays the sense, right? You don't want just a pedal tuner that has the lights, because from the green light in the middle to the next light on either side, you don't know how off that is. You could be 5 or 10 cents sharp or flat just to light up that next light, okay? You want to be really precise. Try to get it right on 0 cents, right bang on tuning, and be absolutely relentless in your quest for good tuning in the studio. It's a pain, it's tedious, but it really pays off in the final result. Mistake 6 is settling for mediocre takes. So now we're moving on from the guitar itself and from tone, into the actual performance, which is where a lot of people fall short, even if they do a lot of the other things decently well. Your standards for how tight and how well played a guitar part is need to be extremely, extremely high, especially if you're in modern rock, metal. If you go listen to these pro records that are coming out today, and not just today, I mean, for the last 20 years, the guitars are so good. They're so in tune. They're so tight. And this is not easy to do. Most guitar players cannot do this without having to split up the parts into smaller and smaller chunks. But that's fine if you have to do it. And for me, I don't like to edit the guitars after the fact. So this tightness from the guitar performance, this comes during the actual performance, not by chopping up and quantizing everything after. I don't do that. I really want to have the tightness of the performance captured right there at the source. So if a guitar player has a 4-bar riff and they can't play it all cleanly, we'll break that down. Can we split it in half? Still not cleanly? Well, we'll split it down even more than that, and we'll record just a couple notes at a time if we have to. Again, I don't want to do that. I don't do that as a matter of course before even trying to record it all. I always want to get the biggest chunk I can, but if we can't get it cleanly and tightly enough, we'll split it up as much as we have to. There's definitely an art to doing this, to doing it well and not making your guitars sound like robotic or MIDI guitars. This is how the pros do it. Minimal editing after the fact, if at all, being absolutely ruthless in judging the quality of takes and really not settling for anything less than close to perfection in the performance that is captured. And when you do this, your tone suddenly sounds 100 times better, right? Like usually people don't have much of a problem with getting a good guitar tone. It's usually just that a sloppy performance, bad tuning. They think that the tone sounds bad, but really it's just all in the performance and playing. And the last guitar tracking mistake is over layering. If you're gonna add a layer of guitar or double something or triple, quadruple, it's gotta have a very clear purpose. And most people are just doubling and layering stuff up because they think that's what's gonna give them a huge wall of sound tone. It's not true. It's actually gonna make your guitars sound worse. And again, if you listen to records that I tracked, those main rhythm guitars, it's just one layer on the left and one layer on the right. That's it. I never quad track and quad layer stuff. If you picture a drawing or a sketch that's on, a transparent background, well, if you start, photocopying that sketch and laying it over top, well, even if it's just a millimeter off with every layer that you add, what's going to happen? That sketch, that image is going to start to look blurry, right? And that's what's happening every time you add other layers. And especially with, more amateur engineers, they're just going to layer and layer and stack and stack and stack while not being very picky about performances. So the result is even worse. But even if you are really picky with performances, this kind of blurring effect is going to happen. And I hope you can see that we're coming down to the same principle underneath all of these things, the guitar setup, the right string gauge, having a simple chain, tuning, performance, all this stuff. It's about pursuing excellence and having the highest possible standard at every step along the way. And it's the same thing with layering, okay? Don't use layers as a way to cover up mistakes. If you want to see a really good example of how to stack and layer guitars with specific purpose for each layer and get a really huge, awesome tone as a result, then go ahead and check out this video right here.